Last night, in the eerie silence of an old church, a priest broke down in tears. Not out of remorse, but out of sheer terror. He whispered the most chilling confession of his life and said he wasn't the mastermind. But he knew exactly who was behind it all. And what if I told you that the name he whispered was Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars, a man who just revealed a secret so dark, even the FBI is afraid to speak of it. A confession powerful enough to bring an entire system crashing down? Watch until the end and let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next shocking secret. After midnight, Father Elias Cordova staggered out of the confessional. His hands were trembling, and his chest heaved as though he had just run a marathon through hell itself. The chapel was silent, except for the flickering candlelight and the slow creaking of the old wood beneath his feet. The air, once filled with the familiar scent of incense and empathy, was now thick with something heavier, a sense of fear. What he had just heard was not a typical confession. It wasn't about lust, theft, or even murder. It was about something much worse, a system, a network, an evil machine so vast that even the toughest men would pale in its presence. Rick Harrison, the familiar face on television, the man recognized by millions as the dry-humored negotiator of dusty collectibles and family heirlooms, sat only a few feet away from him behind wooden bars, his voice low and shaky, confessing sins that would make the devil blush. However, in that gloomy darkness, Rick did not beg for forgiveness. He did not ask for salvation. What he wanted, what he needed, was someone who would finally listen to his side of the story that no one else would believe. Because, as Rick stated, he was not the mastermind. He was just a pawn, moved and discarded at the will of someone greater, someone invisible, someone protected. The priest had never felt such conflict. The sacredness of confession was not just a tradition. It was a sacred law engraved deeply into his soul. But when the chilling details were revealed, mentioning the names of the elite, secret tunnels, encrypted files, and hidden footage, Father Elias realized this was not just about Rick's salvation. This was about the safety of children, the justice of a nation. The revelation of such a terrible secret that could redefine how we view wealth, fame, and influence in America. This moment, the very act of Rick Harrison's confession, was not just a spiritual act of desperation. It was an alarm bell ringing from within the walls of a sacred sanctuary. To the outside world, Rick Harrison had become a disgraced man. Just a week earlier, he had been arrested on shocking allegations that rocked the entertainment industry. Money laundering, human trafficking, possession of illegal documents. It wasn't just a messy tax situation. This was something dark. But the headlines couldn't encompass it all. The anchors stumbled while delivering the accusations. Advertisers made robotic denials. Fans argued in forums, some calling it all fake, others saying it was long overdue. But what no one knew until now was what Rick had whispered that night behind the confession screen. What he whispered between sobs and manic laughter. What he begged someone to believe. He said, "I'm not the one pulling the strings. Want to know the real story? You'd better start looking higher, much higher." And with that, Father Elias's world changed forever. To understand the full extent of this confession, we need to step back a bit. Not too far, just a few months. That was when the first crack appeared in the image Rick had carefully crafted. A viral post buried deep in Reddit described strange events happening behind the scenes of the gold and silver pawn shop. Workers resigned in silence. The surveillance system was upgraded overnight. The back rooms were closed off for renovation for 4 continuous months. At the time, the news wasn't reported. It was considered noise on the internet. But those posts weren't as old as a novel. They were as old as warning signs no one bothered to read. Behind the closed doors, Rick was slipping. He had become paranoid, restless, obsessed with secrecy. At least 2 former employees, speaking under anonymity, described him as no longer the Rick they once knew. They told stories of locked doors with biometric access, of couriers arriving at odd hours, and of strange, wealthy, polite, and always hurried guests. They said Rick spent more time in his private basement than on the shop floor. What was he hiding? Now we know, or at least we've begun to scratch the surface. Father Elias was not just the accidental recipient of a confession. According to sources close to the investigation, Rick specifically requested him. Of all the churches in Las Vegas, of all the priests he could have spoken to, Rick chose Elias. Why? Because many years ago, before fame took hold, Elias and Rick had worked together at a youth shelter program. At that time, Rick was a community man, known for his contributions and occasional speeches at rehabilitation centers. He had helped fund programs, sponsor events, and provide housing for struggling youth. On the surface, it seemed like charitable work, but now that past was being revisited under a much darker lens. Did Rick's early involvement with shelters give him access? Was his charity work a cover for covert operations or grooming? Or was he trying to make up for something he knew he could never undo? That night in the cell, Rick was said to have started with a sentence that sent a chill down the priest's spine. "They used me because I know how to sell a lie." And in the next 45 minutes, Rick told a very disturbing, very complex story that made Father Elias begin to question his own reality. Rick described secret meetings in luxury properties, servers holding thousands of files, transactions carried out through rare artifacts and cryptocurrency, and most condemnable of all, his connection to a person he only referred to as the Collector. According to Rick, the Collector was the real puppet master, a man, or possibly a woman, so well connected that their name was never written down, only whispered. Rick claimed that this Collector ran a network that spanned the globe, with ties to Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C., and even law enforcement. They had everything, and Rick, he was just their face, their bait. The fool standing in front of the cameras while the real monsters hid in the dark. Now skeptics will ask, why would Rick confess now? Why would a man who had lived in this secret for so many years suddenly collapse? The answer, according to Father Elias, lies in fear. Rick wasn't seeking salvation. He was seeking survival. "They're going to kill me," he whispered at least 6 times. "If I fall without saying anything, they win. But if I speak, maybe someone will finally listen." And so, here we are. Someone is listening. But listening is not the same as believing, and believing is not the same as acting. As of this morning, the priest's testimony has not been submitted to any court. Legally, he is bound by the seal of confession. But morally, he stands at a crossroads, and as the pressure mounts from the public, from the media, and from the whispers in the dark, Father Elias knows that he may not have enough time. Strange cars have been spotted parked outside his humble church. Anonymous letters arrived without stamps. His phone rang in the middle of the night. And throughout all that time, one phrase kept repeating in his head. I'm not the mastermind, but I know who the mastermind is. We'll take you into the final days of Rick's freedom. We'll dissect his confession. We'll expose what the authorities found, and we'll follow the breadcrumbs left behind after he was gone. If you think this story is about a reality TV star gone rogue, you're mistaken. This is about the thin line between power and depravity. It's about how darkness hides behind the spotlight. And this is just the beginning. It all started on a typical Thursday morning, the kind of morning Rick Harrison was used to. A light breakfast, a stroll around the back of the pawn shop, a nod to the staff, a short laugh with Chum Lee, and a day filled with transactions involving antique rifles, Elvis memorabilia, and the occasional Civil War relic. But today was different. By 6:13 a.m., before the first customer could even step onto the floor, the gold and silver pawn shop was surrounded. Black SUVs with tinted windows, a dozen federal agents, 2 unmarked police patrol cars parked across the street. The Las Vegas boulevard still flickered with neon lights from the night before, but nothing was as dazzling as what was about to happen. The calm before the storm lasted only a few minutes. And then came the moment that would tear apart the image of one of the most well-known faces on television. Rick Harrison, wearing a black polo shirt and cargo pants, opened the side door to let in a supplier. Instead, he was met with the barrel of an agent's gun and a booming voice ordering him to the ground. At first, he was confused, raising his hands. But when the moment was recorded, when he saw the agents flood into his store, ripping apart display cases and pulling out filing cabinets, he didn't resist. He didn't run. He knew. Somehow he knew they had finally come for him. Witnesses outside the store described the scene as if it were a movie. Agents shouting, dogs barking, Rick being handcuffed on the sidewalk. Some tourists thought it was a joke. Others started filming, but nothing was scripted about this raid. Federal documents later revealed that the charges were truly horrifying. The human trafficking scheme across state borders, the possession and distribution of illegal materials, money laundering, and the laundering of millions of dollars through shell companies linked to fake appraisals and ghost auctions. It was no longer just about money. It was about exploitation, control, and criminal activities that had been deeply entrenched for nearly a decade. The indictment outlined a disturbing network of transactions. Payments were transferred through unclear e-wallet platforms. Money was linked to child modeling companies that never had actual offices. Artifacts were bought and sold for millions of dollars that didn't even exist. Just ghost lists used to launder dirty money. And most frighteningly, the records pointed to shipments, unidentified packages sent from remote areas of Nevada to customers in California, Florida, and even overseas. When the agents stormed the building, they found more than hidden cash. A hidden basement, long believed to be nothing more than a prop storage used for the show, was sealed behind a biometric door. When forced open, they discovered what an investigator later described as a secret museum. Inside were shelves filled with ledgers, USB drives, old DV tapes, and even multiple passports under different names. In the middle of the room, a chair with chains was bolted to the floor. The location sent chills down even the most seasoned agents. But it wasn't just the pawn shop. At the same time, agents raided Harrison's private residence. What they found there added an entirely new layer to the case. Hidden compartments behind bookshelves, a tunnel beneath the garage leading to a fortified underground room. Inside, dozens of costumes, children's-sized clothing, wigs, masks, and props. Surveillance screens displaying live footage from hidden cameras. Some pointed to places that looked like hotel rooms, others to unidentified locations. For years, the public had associated Rick Harrison with antiques, family drama, and quirky historical tales. He was an ordinary man who succeeded without a script, riding the wave of reality TV fame to become a household name. His shop in Las Vegas became a tourist destination. Fans lined up every day just to catch a glimpse, perhaps to shake hands or snap a photo. He was approachable, honest, harmless. It turns out that image was a carefully crafted illusion. The truth, revealed in courtrooms and federal records, was of a man who lived a double life. A public icon by day and allegedly a key figure in one of the most troubling underground networks ever discovered in recent U.S. history. Rick's lawyer, in a press conference just hours after the arrest, painted a different picture. "My client is the victim of manipulation." He claimed that this was not the full story. There were other powerful figures who had used Harrison as a tool to carry out activities beyond his comprehension. When pressed for names or further details, the lawyer evaded, citing pending investigations and threats to personal safety. But the court didn't buy it, at least not immediately. Bail was denied. The judge called the charges deeply troubling and viewed Rick as a flight risk, noting that numerous foreign passports were found during the raid. The prosecution argued that Harrison had access to foreign accounts, private jets, and individuals who could help him disappear without a trace. Inside the cell, Rick was said to have spoken very little. But according to an officer who later revealed a conversation, Rick mumbled to himself, "They said I would be protected. They promised I wouldn't be the one to take the fall." Just that phrase, "take the fall," sent shivers down the spines of those following the case. Because if Rick was the fall guy, that meant there were others, worse, wealthier, smarter, and they were still free. The public's reaction was immediate and chaotic. Fans were divided. Some couldn't believe the allegations, arguing online that Rick was being set up, that it was a conspiracy to ruin a successful businessman. Others dug deeper, revisiting old clips from the show where Rick seemed strange or guests he welcomed seemed odd in hindsight. Reddit exploded with conspiracy threats. YouTube creators scrambled to make expose videos. Former associates began receiving calls from journalists and investigators. The gold and silver pawn shop temporarily closed. Tourism in the area dwindled as the building became the focal point of an ongoing investigation. The city of Las Vegas, always dancing on the edge between spectacle and scandal, had never witnessed anything like this. But beneath the frenzy of social media, deeper questions remained. How long had this been going on? Who helped cover it up? How many people were involved, knowingly or unknowingly? And most importantly, if Rick wasn't the mastermind, then who was? The confession to Father Elias, still not revealed to the authorities, looms larger in the context. For the public, Rick's arrest was the climax of the scandal. But for those inside, those who listened in the confessional room, sifted through records and stared into Rick's tired, wary eyes, this was not the end. It was just the first move in a much larger game. The church remained silent at dawn, the heavy doors closing against the rising morning light. Inside, Father Elias Cordova still knelt at the altar, motionless, with the rosary tightly clenched in his hand, the beads leaving marks on his skin. His lips moved silently, not in prayer, but in struggle. He had been a priest for 34 years. In that time, he had heard thousands of confessions: infidelity, theft, murder, addiction, betrayal, but nothing like this. Never once had he walked out of a confessional with a feeling that shook him to his core. Never had he doubted the sanctity of his vow until now. Rick Harrison's confession had shattered something inside him, not just the weight of the crimes detailed, but the implications, the sheer scale. Rick's voice trembled as if every word cost him something, as if he knew he would never be free again and only wanted someone to hear the truth before the darkness closed in forever. But that truth was now trapped behind an invisible wall, the seal of confession, and Father Elias was its prisoner. The seal was more than just law. It was sacred, an unbreakable trust between the penitent and the divine, with the priest serving merely as the ears. According to canon law, a priest is forbidden from revealing the contents of a confession under any circumstances. Breaking it doesn't just mean excommunication, it means eternal damnation. No exceptions. Not for the sake of law enforcement, not for politics, not for the horror. But what if keeping that secret meant enabling more pain, more death? What if silence was complicity? Father Elias wrestled with this for hours. No sleep, no peace, just pacing in the rectory, running his thin silver hair through his fingers, murmuring scripture under his breath. He kept repeating Rick's words. They used me because I know how to sell a lie. And then, when Rick's voice broke completely, he was still out there, and no one could stop him. They'll blame me because I'm the one they can throw away, but if you tell them maybe, just maybe, someone will listen. The priest's mind was torn between duty and justice, between God and man. And that did nothing to ease the growing tremor of the world outside the church. Just a day after Rick's arrest, strange things began to happen. Father Elias noticed unfamiliar cars parked across the street. One evening, a man dressed in a dark cloak entered the church during evening mass, sat in the back pew, and didn't move for nearly 2 hours. Later, as the congregation dispersed, Elias stepped forward to introduce himself. The man was gone. No footsteps, no sound of a door, just an empty pew and a faint scent of perfume that didn't belong to this place. He began receiving anonymous calls. There was no voice on the other end, just silence. One time he answered and only heard breathing, then a click. At first, he dismissed it, thinking it was just paranoia, but it kept happening. 3 nights in a row, the calls came, 3 different times. And then a note was sent, slipped under the church office door. No envelope, no greeting. It read, You know what happens to those who say no. He didn't talk to the police. Who will he report to? What will he say when someone threatens him over a confession he can't legally discuss? The absurdity of it only deepened his torment. He began keeping a notebook. He scribbled Rick's words in it, every single word from his memory. He mapped out connections, locations, clues, names whispered in part, but never fully disclosed. He hid the notebook under the altar in a carved space meant for holding candles. If he couldn't speak, perhaps he could write it. Maybe someday someone would find it if he disappeared. Each day he carried out his duties as if sleepwalking. He baptized infants, blessed marriages, counseled the grieving, all while feeling like he was sitting on a ticking time bomb. His sermons grew shorter. His smile became strained. The parishioners noticed the change, whispering that Father Elias seemed distracted, pale, haunted. A longtime church member gently asked if he was ill. He almost said yes, because in some way he was sick. He wasn't just clinging to Rick's confession. He was holding on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, God hadn't abandoned this situation. Perhaps God had chosen him to do something brave. But courage is easy to preach and hard to practice when your life and the lives of others are threatened. One late evening, he had a visitor, a gaunt, pale, trembling woman. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days. She didn't give her name, but she knew Rick. She said she had worked at one of the storage facilities Rick rented. She said she had overheard things she wasn't supposed to hear, that she had seen names on boxes that meant nothing. Famous people, politicians, tech billionaires. They came at night, she said. Always at night, always the same cars. Sometimes Rick was there, sometimes not. But they acted as if they owned the place. And then one night, Rick showed up drunk. He said he was tired of playing the fool. He said he wanted out. She was terrified. She had quit 2 weeks before the raid, but now that Rick was behind bars, she didn't feel safe anymore. She said she had nowhere else to go, that she didn't trust the police. And then, with desperation etched in her voice, she asked Elias the last question that broke him. Why hasn't anyone stepped up? Why is everyone silent? He couldn't answer. He offered her food, a place to rest. But her words pierced something inside him that even scripture couldn't soothe. The next morning, Father Elias opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out an envelope. Inside it was a single name written on the back of a church bulletin, the Taxman. It was the only name Rick had ever directly mentioned. No name, no address, just a title. And even then it was spoken with a trembling fear. The Taxman, a name whispered by those in the dark, a figure cloaked in wealth, anonymity, and power. According to Rick, the collector ran the whole operation. Trading, money laundering, silencing. Rick described him as someone who never got his hands dirty because he owned the gloves everyone else wore. Was the collector real, or was he just a product of Rick's blame-shifting effort? Father Elias didn't know, but he had to do something. So he wrote a letter, not to the police, not to the media, but to himself, a confession with his own date, outlining what he had heard, how it made him feel, and the impossible position it placed him in. He sealed it and hid it in a notebook. If anything happened to him, perhaps someone would piece it together. And he remained silent because he couldn't break the vow himself, because he didn't know who to trust, and because deep down, he feared the worst. Perhaps, just perhaps, God no longer sees. Rick Harrison didn't cry throughout the confession. That was what lingered with Father Elias long after the last words were spoken. The man's voice cracked. It trembled. It hesitated under the weight of the memories and guilt. But not once did he cry. Not for himself. Not for those he admitted had been harmed under his watch. Not for the innocence that had been destroyed. Because in Rick's eyes, the story wasn't about him. It was about someone else, someone much larger, someone he repeatedly referred to in a low, almost reverent tone as the Collector. A name that sounded like it belonged in a fable or a horror novel. But to Rick, it was a name soaked in terror, a blurry reality hidden behind everything he had done, a presence he couldn't escape from. Rick had said in his confession that the Collector was the kind of person you couldn't say no to. You didn't question him. You didn't even look him in the eye unless he allowed it. He wasn't famous. He wasn't even listed in any public companies, but he owned everything, everyone. According to Rick's chilling account, the Collector was the silent force that directed the human trafficking operation. He wasn't the one moving boxes or making payments. He didn't appear in surveillance footage or sign any shipping invoices, but he was always there, hidden in plain sight. Rick said he first met the Collector over a decade ago at a famous auction in Los Angeles. Rick had been invited to appraise a rare historical item, a military sword from the 1800s that was rumored to belong to a U.S. general. The auction was private. The guest list was exclusive. There were no journalists, no cameras, just men in tailored suits whispering over glasses of dark wine, and more bodyguards than artifacts. That night, Rick didn't just appraise the sword. He was approached by a tall man in a perfectly fitted gray suit. The man didn't give his name, but his tone carried the weight of someone who didn't need to. He praised Rick's eye for value. He said Rick's TV fame made him trustworthy to the public. And then he offered him a chance to be part of a much more profitable world, one that didn't just deal with artifacts and collectibles, but dealt with influence, secrets, and silence. At first, Rick refused, but the Collector wouldn't take no for an answer. A few weeks later, Rick's house was broken into. Nothing was stolen. Only one item was left behind. A black and white photo of his son, with a very easy-to-read message written in red ink on the back. The message was clear. Rick was in, and once he was in, he realized this operation wasn't new. It had been running for years, possibly decades. Rick said the Collector had eyes everywhere. Studios, government offices, tech companies, financial organizations. Everyone owed him something. Everyone was afraid of him. According to Rick's confession, the Collector never used a phone. He communicated through burned notes, delivered by trusted couriers. The meetings always changed locations, sometimes on yachts, sometimes in underground lounges, sometimes behind the walls of legitimate businesses. The operations were complex. Rick's job was simple. Be the face, be the harmless businessman, be the front. They trust me, Rick told the priest. They come to my shop with their guards down. They think I'm just a pawnshop guy. They never suspect what's hidden behind the curtain. That's why he used me. Rick claimed he was directed to transfer money through fake collectibles. Sometimes the items were actual rare coins, antique books, military equipment, but most often they were phantom assets, transactions to cover payments for services unrelated to antiques, services related to shipping, discretion, silence. The taxman paid him handsomely, but with chains attached. There was a time Rick tried to back out. He told the collector's messenger that he was done, that it was too much, that he was being watched. The next day, he received a package in the mail. Inside was a lock of hair, golden and freshly cut. No note, no return address, but Rick recognized it. It belonged to a girl he had once seen at one of the collector's private meetings. A girl he suspected never went outside. That was the last time he disobeyed. And then Rick said something that froze the priest's blood. He's protected. You'll never touch him. No one ever has. Do you know why? Because he's the master of consequences. People disappear when they whisper his name. Accidents happen. Investigations turn dark. Even the FBI won't touch him unless they want their families to disappear. Rick named not the mastermind, but those around him. Powerful Hollywood agents. Billionaires who organize charity events requiring NDAs before entry. Politicians who smile for photos and write checks for funds that never exist. Rick claimed all of them answer to the taxman, some knowingly, some unknowingly. But they all contributed to keeping the machine alive, with one chilling moment in Rick's confession when his voice faltered, not from something worse. The most disturbing part is that Rick doesn't deny his crimes. He doesn't claim innocence. He knows what he did. But what haunts him is the realization that even when he takes the fall, the real evil won't be touched. He'll bury this story, Rick said. He'll weave it. Maybe I'll die in prison. Maybe I'll have to take responsibility for everything. But you're the only one I've told. You're the only one who knows the truth. In that moment, Father Elias realized the weight of what had been given to him. It wasn't just a confession, a curse, because now he knew. And with that knowledge came danger. Rick's final plea: if something happens to me, don't let them erase it. Don't let him win. The collector remained a shadow, a legend, a rumor hidden in plain sight. But if Rick's story is true, he's not just a man. He's an empire of silence, a puppeteer pulling the strings from behind the curtain of power. And the more people try to say his name, the quicker silence closes in. The first team entered the pawn shop with precision, moving in formation as though preparing for a gang bust rather than a celebrity raid. At 6:13 a.m., armed agents stormed the main store while others surrounded the side entrances. An arrest warrant had been secured just hours earlier after weeks of surveillance and insider information, some of which was allegedly sourced from foreign intelligence partners monitoring international trafficking channels. The federal agencies weren't just looking for evidence of money laundering, they were looking for something deeper. And what they found inside Rick Harrison's domain was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The gold and silver pawn shop had long been advertised as a quirky little corner of Las Vegas history. Tourists wandered through the cluttered aisles like visitors at a roadside museum. But what lay beyond the customer-facing area, through the back rooms labeled as staff only, told a completely different story. It was in these hidden spaces that the truth began to take shape. This operation wasn't like a surface-level crime business. It was elegant, deceptive, and meticulously structured. The first red flag appeared when the agents busted open a reinforced metal door hidden behind a false wall in Rick's private office. Behind it, they found a staircase leading down to a hidden underground space, far more advanced than what one would expect from a pawnshop owner. The staircase led to a room resembling a bunker, with steel walls, soundproofing, and a heavy biometric scanner guarding a secondary room. Inside that room was the nerve center of the operation. It was a tech fortress. Servers lined the walls, humming with encrypted data. Dozens of hard drives were labeled not with item codes, but with initials, dates, and a disturbing one-word title like Audition, Shipping Product, and Collection. Some USB drives were stored in a locked box inside a hidden safe behind an antique bookshelf, which could only be triggered by removing a specific 1920s revolver from the display case. The agents worked for hours cataloging everything. And then came the tapes. Old digital videotapes, DV tapes, each labeled with a symbol rather than a name, encrypted in a system the FBI had never seen before. When played on a secure, isolated system later that day, the footage revealed grainy surveillance clips. Children, teenagers, some filmed in undisclosed hotel rooms, others in what appeared to be private homes, storage spaces, or staged settings resembling playrooms. One tape showed a blindfolded boy being handed a costume while an adult quietly watched from the shadows. The footage served as evidence of staging, grooming, and role-playing. None of this involved overt behavior on the tapes, but the implications were massive. What had been recorded wasn't about monetary transactions or antique deals. It was about manipulation, control, and psychological preparation. In another drawer hidden behind antique chests with false bottoms, the agents found passports. A total of 15 passports. None of them belonged to Rick. All of them had children's names. All of them had mismatched photos. Some photos were drawings. Some were digital reproductions. And all of them, according to authorities, were used as fake identities to facilitate cross-border trafficking activities. There were customs documents that didn't match any known items. The shipping manifest for the rare items never arrived. Bank statements revealed transfers to accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and a private bank in Singapore, all linked to a company named Echelon Grange Limited. According to Interpol, that company is merely a front used in multiple human trafficking investigations across Southeast Asia. But perhaps the most damning discovery came in the form of photographs, Polaroid pictures. Hundreds of them, each numbered, each featuring a different child. Some were sleeping, some sat on chairs, some posed with toys. No timestamps, no names, only expressions. Some vacant, some terrified, others rehearsed, far beyond their years. Agents later testified that some of the photographed children matched missing persons reports filed over a span of 15 years. The scale of the operation was too vast to process immediately. A federal agent, renowned for dismantling child exploitation rings, reportedly vomited into a trash can after watching just 10 minutes of a recorded tape. Another had to take medical leave after the raid, citing stress-related trauma. Back on the ground, the FBI expanded their search to Rick Harrison's private residence. It was a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Las Vegas, largely hidden from public view, surrounded by private fencing and reinforced gates. There, they uncovered even more secrets. Behind a decorative wine rack in the kitchen was a hidden passageway leading to a secondary room. Inside were costumes, not just ordinary disguises. These were specific. Animal suits sized for children, princess dresses, cosplay outfits designed for young bodies. Some bore detailed notes. Lily likes the green spasms when touched behind her left ear. Don't speak loudly. It's clear someone is studying these children, profiling them, tracking their behavior, and preparing scenarios. Even more troubling is the presence of a fully furnished children's bedroom deep underground. The bed was made, the toys arranged. A nightlight still flickered softly in the corner, yet no child has been publicly linked to Rick's family in recent years. Investigators believe the room was used as part of a grooming process. If what you just heard sends chills down your spine, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because the truth behind Rick's family might be even more terrifying than we imagined. There were also live feeds, screens showing hallways, lodge interiors, even a private jet. These weren't archived, they were real-time. Some were set up with audio feeds. Voices could be heard, conversations, footsteps, laughter. None of the people in the videos knew they were being watched. The entire setup suggests a network far more coordinated than a lone predator. It was an empire of surveillance, experimentation, and power. Agents eventually uncovered a digital ledger, password-protected and buried deep within a secure server. Once cracked, it revealed a database of encrypted entries. Each entry listed a package ID, purchase date, behavioral notes, storage location, and intended delivery destination. The language was deliberately vague, but the patterns were undeniable. These weren't inventory logs. They were human trafficking schedules. The FBI didn't release the names tied to those records, not to the press, not even to Rick's defense team. But leaks began to surface. Screenshots, descriptions, whispers from anonymous sources in the investigation, and the names mentioned were shocking. Actors, musicians, politicians, celebrities, some of the most recognizable names in American culture. They signed for the packages, they paid the fees. Some were said to have visited Rick's property. Others paid to stay silent, but with each name that surfaced, another layer of protection was peeled back. Lawyers issued cease and desist orders. PR firms worked overtime. Media outlets quietly pulled stories from their websites. The storm was spreading but still being buried. As the FBI tried to piece together the scope of the network, a chilling truth became clear. Rick Harrison was never the mastermind. He was the handler, the face, the middleman. The recordings proved he was involved, that he facilitated, that he covered things up. But the system was designed by someone else. Rick had warned Father Elias. They'll find some things. Maybe enough to scare people, but they'll never see the whole web. You know why? Because the moment they do, the entire country will collapse. And for the investigators poring over servers, photos, and schedules, that might not be an exaggeration. The moment Rick Harrison's name hit the press, it sent ripples through the entertainment industry. But as the investigation dug deeper and evidence came to light, screenshots, transfers, sealed court records, those ripples turned into waves of reckoning. And at the center of it all was an unshakable truth that law enforcement and insiders couldn't ignore. Rick Harrison didn't operate alone. He was part of something bigger, and the people tied to him weren't anonymous criminals lurking in the shadows. They were celebrities, public figures, icons, and many had stepped foot in the gold and silver shop. When federal agents reviewed the shop's surveillance archives, files hidden on encrypted servers, they were stunned to find that Rick had kept far more footage than necessary, not just for legal reasons. These weren't the shop's security footage. They were backstage recordings, secret meetings, private exchanges in the back room, guests who came through the side entrance to avoid the public line, guests who left without receipts, celebrities who stayed for hours but never appeared on the show, celebrities who, after cross-referencing financial records, were found to have wired large sums to shell companies directly linked to Harrison's encrypted logs. The question isn't whether they knew. It's how much they knew and why they stayed so silent. One of the most alarming discoveries was a document labeled Friends of the House, a neatly typed guest list with names, dates, and small coded remarks beside each entry. Some remarks were harmless. Negotiation went smoothly or requested VIP treatment, but others were deeply suspicious. Likes blindfold scenarios. One note read, "No recordings allowed. Special package delivery prearranged," another added. And then there were names marked with symbols, a star, a triangle, a circle. Each symbol, according to investigators, indicated the individual's level of access or awareness of the trafficking operations. Among the names leaked to investigative reporters through covert channels were A-list actors, major music producers, reality TV stars, and a handful of international figures. While mainstream media refrained from directly publishing any of these names due to legal pressure, independent outlets began releasing edited lists that were enough to set the internet ablaze with speculation. Online sleuths cross-referenced the pawn shop appearances of celebrities with the dates on the Friends of the House list. Patterns emerged. Some celebrities visited only once. Others became regulars. Some even invested in properties later revealed to be used for off-grid transfers or filming locations. A well-known actor, recognized for wholesome roles and a family-friendly brand, appeared at the pawn shop in 2017-2019 and again during the pandemic, allegedly during a lockdown when the shop was supposedly closed. Surveillance footage showed him arriving through the employee entrance. No cameras in the lobby, no public greeting. He stayed for nearly 3 hours and left with a black canvas bag. Another figure, a well-known daytime talk show host, was accused of wiring a total of over $400,000 to one of Harrison's shell companies. When questioned, their team claimed the transaction was for a rare watch purchase. No watch matching that description was found in the pawn shop's inventory. And even more troubling was the appearance of a former child star who had vanished from the spotlight. His name appeared multiple times in Harrison's files, linked to coded entries matching behavioral logs found in the underground vault. A whistleblower within the investigative force told reporters that this individual was not only involved in the scenarios, but was also allegedly helping to recruit others. This wasn't just a guest list, it was a web. Connections tied Rick to exclusive Hollywood events, private islands of tech billionaires, and underground tea rooms where phones were banned and guests were required to sign non-disclosure agreements before entering. Some of these gatherings, according to insiders, had nothing to do with business or entertainment. They were disguised as experiential art nights or immersive workshops. But those on the fringes, staff, servers, security, shared very different stories. A former bartender recalled a party where guests were served cocktails named after colors: white fog, black feather, indigo room. Behind closed doors, there were themed rooms. One was designed to look like a school classroom, another like a hospital ward. Attendees wore masks, roles were assigned, and those who didn't participate were asked to leave, often under threat from men dressed in all black. The bartender quit the next morning, but not before spotting a guest, Rick Harrison, standing in the hallway talking to someone he called the collector. This detail confirmed what many had begun to suspect, that Rick wasn't just being exploited for his access or public image. He was trusted, familiar, a safe face, and through him, a network of powerful people could operate in plain sight under the guise of banter and transactions. Some major talent management companies scrambled after the leaks. PR specialists were fired. Legal teams were dispatched to scrub references. A prominent streaming service quietly removed 3 episodes of Pawn Stars featuring guests now under suspicion. A film halted reshoots after 2 actors were named in connection to the investigation, and a singer canceled her tour, citing emotional exhaustion just days after reports tied her name to Harrison's storage vault. Yet for all the panic, few spoke out directly. The silence was deafening. Some believed it was fear. Others said it was guilt. But those following the story closely saw it differently. They believed these figures were waiting to see how far the investigation would go, whether Rick would talk, and, most crucially, whether the public would move on. Because in Hollywood, the strongest defense isn't innocence. It's deflection. Rick's lawyer, in a private statement later leaked to a handful of journalists, said something cryptic but chilling. "My client has provided names. He's provided details. If anything happens to him in custody, if he's found dead, if he disappears, the floodgates will open. There's a dossier." There's a trigger, and when it goes off, careers won't just be ruined, lives will be ruined. That statement was later corroborated by a federal agent who confirmed the existence of a sealed dossier named Echo Network, Tier 1 Connections. Though its contents remain classified, sources say it contains direct links between Rick's operations and at least 25 high-profile individuals in American entertainment and politics. Yet, the public's reaction remains divided. Some refuse to believe Rick's connections are mere coincidence. Others believe the entertainment industry is in full cover-up mode. Online forums grow by the hour. Citizen investigators share maps, timelines, and redacted documents. Reddit threads draw lines between missing persons cases and Hollywood premieres. And through it all, the same question keeps resurfacing. How many of our favorite stars, our idols, our icons, the faces on magazine covers, were not just bystanders but participants? The guest list exists. The records are real. The footage has been seen. All that's left is the exposure. It wasn't just the words Rick Harrison spoke to Father Elias in that midnight confession. It wasn't merely a recounting of crimes, a catalog of regrets, or a plea for forgiveness. It was something far more tangible and far more damning. According to the priest's whispered account, at one point in the confession, Rick leaned closer to the lattice wall separating them and said something that instantly shifted the tone from chilling to unbearable. "I kept copies," Rick muttered. "Not to blackmail anyone, not to sell, just for insurance. Because if I got caught, I knew I'd need something undeniable." And then, without hesitation, Rick told Father Elias where they were. Not all of them, not the entire archive, but a select few. Certain recordings that, by his account, captured enough to corroborate everything he confessed and enough to make some very powerful people nervous. He didn't hand the recordings directly to the priest. That would have been too dangerous for both of them. But he gave Elias a description of where they could be found, if needed. "If things went south, if he didn't make it, you'll know it when you see it," Rick said. "The silver case in the crawl space for chapel maintenance. I hid them there last year during a storm. Figured no one would look under God's roof." Father Elias didn't sleep that night. He didn't even wait for dawn. As soon as Rick left the confessional, he slipped into the side passage behind the chapel's furnace room. There, tucked behind a section of crumbling plaster, was a locked silver briefcase, dusty and dented. No key was provided, but the lock was flimsy. With trembling hands and a crowbar, the priest pried it open. Inside were 5 digital videotapes labeled not with names, but with Roman numerals, I, 2, 3, 4, V. No notes, no instructions, just a USB drive and a small folded paper with the words, "View in order." Father Elias didn't want to watch them. Every part of him resisted, but he knew that once he opened that case, once he saw what Rick had seen, there was no going back. He waited until the chapel was empty at the crack of dawn. Then, using an old desktop computer stored in the parish library, he plugged in the USB. The first video was labeled simply, "Playroom." The footage was grainy, black and white, and silent. The room appeared to be a children's play area. Toys scattered on the floor, a small table with coloring books, a rocking horse in the corner, and sitting in the middle of the room, her back to the camera, was a young girl, maybe 8, maybe 9. She was silent, still, staring at the door. "10 minutes passed before the door opened, and a man walked in. His face was partially obscured by the angle, but Father Elias immediately noticed he wore gloves. He said nothing, just slowly circled the girl, observing her, jotting notes on a clipboard. Then, after a few minutes, the screen went black. The second tape was worse. Titled "Session," the footage opened with a teenage boy being led into a room resembling a therapist's office. There were plush chairs, soft lighting, and 2 cameras, one visible, one hidden. The boy sat down, and another person entered, this one wearing a full mask. They began asking the boy a series of questions about his fears, habits, and family. The questions seemed innocent at first, but grew darker. "What's your biggest secret? Has anyone ever touched you? Would you tell if they did?" The boy's responses were barely audible. He kept his eyes down. At some point, he started crying. The figure said nothing, just watched. The video ended with the boy being led out by someone else. No names, no dialogue, but the emotional devastation on the child's face was unforgettable. The third video was the shortest, just 3 minutes, but carried the most chilling weight. Titled "Arrival," it was surveillance footage of an airport hangar. A private jet rolled into place. A black SUV pulled up seconds later. A group of men stepped out carrying what appeared to be hard-shell travel cases. One case, when viewed frame by frame, showed a small hand pressing against the inside. The angle revealed a man standing at the plane's entrance, his posture unmistakable, the gateway undeniable. It was Rick Harrison. He didn't speak in the video, but he made a hand gesture, 3 fingers down, 1 index finger, a signal, a command. The 4th tape had no title, just static at first. Then images slowly emerged. A basement, chains hanging on the walls, a table set up for medical procedures, 4 empty bags, a tray of syringes. The camera panned slowly, methodically, as if someone were documenting the space. In the background, a faint voice could be heard, singing a lullaby, off-key and almost mechanical. This tape was the longest, over 20 minutes. No people were shown, just objects, rooms, tools, instruments. Yet it felt more terrifying than any act of violence. It was a monument to preparation, to planning, to someone who had designed every square inch with a specific purpose. The final tape was simply labeled X. It opened with a wide shot of a mansion's ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, velvet curtains, dozens of people in formal attire, faces hidden by masks, some dancing, others standing in corners sipping wine. The camera slowly zoomed in on one guest, a man in a white suit, unmasked, confidently moving from group to group, shaking hands. His face was unmistakable. He was a household name, a beloved actor, an Oscar winner. He was smiling. This footage, more than any other, confirmed the authenticity of Rick's confession. This wasn't fantasy. This wasn't paranoia. This was documentation, raw, undeniable, horrifying. Father Elias turned off the computer and sat in silence for nearly an hour. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His breathing grew ragged. He had heard the confession. Now he had seen it. This was no longer just about what Rick said. It was about what Rick knew and what he had been forced to partake in. Those tapes were his insurance policy, but to Father Elias they were a curse, because now he carried not just the burden of knowledge, but of evidence. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew how much it would cost. If he turned the tapes over to the authorities, he risked breaking the seal of confession. If he handed them over anonymously, they might never reach the right hands. If he kept them, he could be the next target. And there was always the possibility he wasn't the only one who knew they existed. He had seen men parked outside the church for days. He had received letters with no return address. Notes slipped through his mail slot at night. Warnings, ultimatums. One note read, "You've seen what you weren't meant to see. That makes you part of it now." He didn't know who sent it, but he knew they were right. Father Elias had entered the confessional that night seeking absolution. Instead, he inherited a nightmare. The courtroom fell silent as Rick Harrison was escorted through a side door, wrists cuffed, face pale but unreadable. The clicking of cameras from the hallway had just begun to fade, and a heavy silence settled over the gallery. For the first time since the raid, Rick would speak, not through a confessional, not behind closed doors, but in open court, surrounded by journalists, victims' families, and federal prosecutors who had sifted through the ashes of the empire he had carefully built. The charges against him kept piling up. Initially arrested for money laundering and human trafficking, Rick now faced additional counts of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and illegal surveillance. The evidence amassed by the FBI was staggering. A collection of digital archives, financial transactions, encrypted communications, and hours of disturbing footage. But while the prosecution prepared to expose every facet of the horror, the defense had an entirely different strategy. They didn't deny the existence of the evidence. They denied Rick's role in controlling it. According to his defense team, Rick Harrison was not the architect of this operation. He was the fall guy. A man manipulated, coerced, and ultimately discarded by a shadowy network far above his pay grade. His lawyer, a tough, articulate man named Victor Helms, spoke in court with a deliberate calm that was both infuriating and persuasive. Mr. Harrison was not a mastermind, he said. He was a witness, a broken cog in a machine he didn't build, a man whose fame and visibility made him an ideal shield, and now he was being asked to take the fall for an entire system designed to protect the untouchables. The courtroom murmured. Some scoffed, others leaned forward, listening. Helms pressed on. He explained how Rick was approached by wealthy individuals under the guise of partnerships and business opportunities. He pointed to a moment when Rick's finances suddenly spiked, unrelated to television ratings, but tied to private investments from anonymous donors. He produced evidence showing Rick's travel logs included visits to properties later linked to the trafficking network, but always at the direction of others. One of the boldest claims came when Helms revealed that Rick had informally approached law enforcement years ago with vague concerns, trying to distance himself from those he believed were exploiting him. Helms argued that effort was dismissed for lack of specificity, and Rick's reluctance to name names that might have rattled the elite even then. The prosecution struck back swiftly. Assistant U.S. Attorney Melanie Carson stood tall and focused, her words sharp and unrelenting. She laid out a timeline of Rick's actions, not based on theories but on hard data. Surveillance footage, bank records, messages recovered from encrypted messaging apps. She made it clear Rick wasn't just present, he was active. He managed shipments, signed for deliveries, directed employees to carry out suspicious tasks under the radar, coordinated with foreign operatives, and most damningly, personally handled documents matching several missing persons cases. Carson didn't let the defense's narrative of a man caught in a web go unchallenged. She displayed photos of Rick smiling at those private events, emails where he joked about upcoming packages, ledgers he signed, voice recordings recovered from a burner phone found at one of the safe houses where Rick's voice could be heard saying, "Make sure this one doesn't talk." There was a moment when she paused, turned to face the jury and said, "This is not a man who was merely used. This is a man who chose." Again and again, and now he wants to hide behind the shadows that once protected him. The room fell silent again. Outside the courtroom, protesters gathered. Some held signs demanding justice. Others accused the media of running a smear campaign. Rick's fans, those who still believed he was innocent, shouted in reporters' faces. A woman, clutching a framed photo of her son, missing for 5 years, sobbed at the courthouse gates, begging someone to tell her if her child appeared in any of the tapes. The proceedings had become a media circus. Television analysts debated Rick's guilt nightly. Some framed him as a villain, a predator hiding in plain sight. Others leaned toward the defense, suggesting Rick was just the latest name floated to distract from something deeper. Behind the scenes, the FBI was still building its case. More raids were conducted. Properties across states were searched. Rick's associates were quietly detained for questioning. Some turned. A former employee, whose identity was withheld for safety, testified in a closed hearing that Rick had offered him bonuses to keep certain doors locked and ignore unlisted deliveries. The prosecution also revealed that several prominent lawyers had attempted to meet privately with Rick. They weren't part of his legal team. They represented third parties, names still unreported. They offered him deals, money, promises of protection if he just stayed silent, if he didn't implicate others. According to his lawyer, Rick rejected those offers. Why? The court asked. Helms's response was pointed, because even Rick knew silence was no longer an option. Not when he had been marked for destruction by the very people who had exploited him. Yet, even as the legal proceedings unfolded, whispers persisted about a potential plea deal. Not one that would lessen Rick's sentence, but one that would expose others if he chose to speak. Sources close to the Department of Justice confirmed a proposal was under consideration. Immunity from the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation, including names, addresses, video files, and sworn testimony. But this is where things took an unexpected turn. Rick refused. He didn't deny knowing more. He didn't claim innocence. He simply refused to name names. His reason? If I talk, they'll kill everyone I care about, and then they'll disappear me too. In a rare moment of speaking directly, the judge asked Rick during the hearing, "Are you saying you fear for your life if you tell the truth?" Rick looked up, eyes sunken, and replied, "I fear for more than my life. I fear the silence that follows, the kind that buries the truth under influence and turns it into a conspiracy." That was one of the few times Rick's voice was heard publicly since his arrest. The defense tried to use it as proof of a man terrified and buckling under pressure. The prosecution argued it was a final manipulative tactic, a way to garner sympathy while refusing to help. Public opinion shifted daily. Editorials, YouTube documentaries, and podcasts have dissected every trial transcript. And still, the bigger question looms. If Rick Harrison isn't the mastermind, then who is? And if he truly holds the keys to the kingdom, if the names, tapes, and codes are locked in his memory or on some hidden drive, what is he waiting for? Justice, revenge, protection? Or has the weight of the machine finally broken him? If Rick Harrison is telling the truth, if he really isn't the mastermind behind this operation, then someone else is. Someone with the power to direct, to fund, to erase. And if Rick's claims are even partially true, this person doesn't act alone. They're surrounded by a shield of protection, a force field of influence, money, and silence strong enough to steer investigations, suppress media coverage, and destroy loose ends before questions can even be asked. This isn't just a criminal enterprise, it's a system. And like all systems built to endure, it has safeguards in place. From the start of the federal investigation, agents began hitting walls. Walls that didn't look like walls at first. Search warrants were delayed. Judges recused themselves with little explanation. Digital evidence mysteriously vanished from forensic labs. Court records were abruptly sealed, not at the defense's request, but by unnamed government officials citing national security concerns. That was the first red flag. The second came when witnesses started disappearing. Two individuals, former employees at Rick's storage facility in Henderson, Nevada, were scheduled to testify about shipments they handled in 2021 and 2022. Both vanished within a week of being added to the witness list. One was said to have left town without telling anyone. The other was found dead in a motel. The coroner cited suicide despite inconsistencies in the autopsy process. The timing was beyond suspicious. Investigators began to suspect they themselves were being watched. An agent working the case was reassigned without notice. His access to files was revoked. No public statement was made, but those close to him said he had recently been digging into an offshore account where Rick's shell company had funneled money to a bank owned by a financial group tied to a former senator. Then came the media crackdowns. In the weeks following Rick's arrest, several independent journalists began publishing exposés on the case. But within hours, their articles vanished. Servers were wiped, domains redirected. A YouTuber who created a viral video linking Rick to an international trafficking network saw their entire channel deleted overnight with no warning or appeal. Whispers began to spread that the case had entered a realm where traditional justice couldn't reach. A realm where silence was bought, narratives controlled, and anyone asking the wrong questions paid a price. It wasn't just the media. Government agencies themselves were reportedly under pressure. A leaked email from a Department of Homeland Security employee revealed that higher-ups were urging caution in pursuing suspects not in the public interest to name. Another email, sent internally at the Department of Justice, warned against tainting high-profile cases with unverified political overlap. But where was this pressure coming from? According to two anonymous whistleblowers, both claiming to have worked in data analysis units supporting the case, many of the names and private client lists tied to Rick overlapped with major donors to political campaigns, board members of global NGOs, and senior executives at several entertainment conglomerates. They're not anonymous players. They're the kind who can pick up a phone and make headlines disappear. The kind who can move money through 3 countries before the sun sets. The kind who don't get caught because they own the net. A former intelligence advisor, speaking on a restricted podcast episode later taken down, put it bluntly. The thing about a guy like Rick is he's useful, visible, distracting. He fits a story. But the real architects, the ones controlling the flow of information, leveraging power, they don't show up on tapes. They don't use their own names. They exist above the ceiling we call justice. And when they feel threatened, they don't fight, they erase. If that's true, what hope is there for uncovering the truth? Even the tapes Rick provided, those horrifying pieces of evidence, were never entered into the public record. The files were immediately classified, locked in a secure database accessible to only a handful of people. An agent who reviewed them was said to have taken extended mental health leave. Another department was reassigned within 72 hours. The contents of the tapes were deemed too dangerous, not just for what they showed, but for who they showed. It was clear that even within the system, fear had taken hold. Yet, amid the suppression, the intimidation, the vanishing evidence, a question began to gain traction outside official channels. Who is the collector? The name first surfaced in Rick's confession, but as the investigation progressed, it began appearing in the most unexpected places, encoded in ledgers, referenced in anonymous tips, mentioned in whistleblower interview transcripts. Always vague, always indirect, but always carrying the same undertone of fear. Some speculate the collector is a single individual. Others believe it's a title passed from one person to another, a seed of power holding the reins of the network, shielded by layers of cutouts and proxies. There's even a theory that the collector isn't just one person, but a group operating under a shared identity to maintain plausible deniability. Whoever or whatever they are, the evidence points to a chilling reality. This figure has influence over every sector Rick ever touched: law enforcement, entertainment, finance, legal institutions, and no one names them. Father Elias, when asked by an internal investigator if he believed Rick's story, reportedly responded with a heavy pause and a single sentence: "I believe he saw the face of the devil, and the devil was wearing a suit." As pressure mounted on the Department of Justice to act more aggressively, internal divisions began to form. Some agents wanted to pursue the case to its end, to chase the real puppeteers. Others warned that pushing too far would provoke retaliation, not just legal retaliation, career-ending consequences, threats to families, false accusations. Around this time, independent investigators began publishing redacted databases showing links between Rick's financial network and lobbying groups in Washington. Some records pointed to campaign donations, others tied to companies awarded federal contracts. What seemed like a small local scandal has now spread like a web, and Rick still refuses to name names. The court has sealed every file, and the media dances around the truth, too cautious to step into the fire. So who's protecting the mastermind? Those with something to lose, those who benefit from the silence, those who fear the chain reaction full exposure could ignite. Rick Harrison may be the face, the pawn, the facilitator, but the real king remains untouched, unnamed, and still pulling the strings from the shadows. Leave a comment below. Who do you think is truly behind it all? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of this hidden truth.